The wind came low across the prairie that evening, dragging dust in long ribbons over the brittle grass and against the warped boards of the Dawson ranch house. The sky held that faded gold peculiar to late autumn, when the sun seemed reluctant to leave but unwilling to stay. Mary Lou Dawson stood on the porch with one cardboard suitcase at her feet and a folded notice pressed flat inside her coat pocket. She had read it 3 times already. The ink had not changed. She was 18 years old and twice buried. The first burial had been her girlhood, traded for a wedding band and a promise of steady work. The second had been her husband, Thomas, lowered into hard earth the previous spring after a gate chain snapped and a spooked steer crushed him against a corral post. Men said it was an accident. Men also said the chain should have been replaced months earlier. The owner of the ranch, Mr. Caldwell, had nodded gravely at the funeral and spoken of God's will. Then he sent word that the bunkhouse lease ended with Thomas's life. The sheriff had delivered the notice himself that morning. He did not meet her eyes. Now the house behind her felt less like shelter and more like borrowed air. Inside, the kitchen table still bore the knife marks Thomas had carved when talk ran long and tense. His boots remained beneath the bed because she had not yet found the strength to move them. She had taken only what she could carry. The rest would be left to dust and strangers. Below the porch, the ranch hands moved about their work without looking up. They were not cruel men, only careful. Caldwell's cattle filled the lower pasture, sleek and heavy with the season's profit. At the far edge of the property stood a smaller pen, set apart as though even the earth had chosen to forget it. That was where the horse waited. They called him Rust, though his coat held more ash than red now. He was tall but drawn thin, ribs faint beneath hide, one flank marked by a long pale scar that tugged the hair crooked. His left eye bore a cloudy film that made him appear half withdrawn from the world. He did not pace the fence like the younger horses. He stood still, head low, as if conserving something unseen. Thomas had once said the animal was trouble. "Won't break right," he had muttered, tightening a girth strap. "Got it in his bones to resist." Caldwell had agreed. A horse that would not yield quick was a horse that cost time, and time on that ranch translated to coin. Russ had been pushed aside, fed enough to live, never enough to shine. Mary Lou descended the porch steps and crossed the yard. The dust rose around her boots in small, obedient clouds. She did not hurry. She had learned since the funeral that haste invited tears, and tears wasted water she did not possess. When she reached the pen, she rested her hands on the top rail and waited. The horse did not approach. He did not retreat. For a long moment, they regarded one another across the fading light. Two creatures left over from a story that had moved on without them. She saw the faint tremor in his flank when a gust of wind struck. He saw, perhaps, the thinness of her wrists where sleeves failed to hide hunger. Behind her, boots crunched on gravel. Caldwell's voice carried easily. "You've till sunrise, Mrs. Dawson. After that, the place reverts." She turned. He stood broad and confident, coat collar turned against the wind. His expression bore a courtesy that did not extend to mercy. "There's one more matter," he added, glancing toward the pen. "That horse. We're clearing stock before winter. Slaughter wagon comes Friday. If you've a mind to take him off my hands, you may. Saves me the trouble." The offer fell between them like a coin tossed into mud. Mary Lou understood its shape at once. A gesture of charity that cost him nothing. A burden disguised as favor. She had no pasture of her own, no savings beyond the few dollars sewn into her hem. A horse ate more than pride could provide. "He ain't worth riding," Caldwell went on. Clouded eyes, stubborn streak. "Useless, truth be told." The word struck her with peculiar force. Useless. It was the same word whispered in town since Thomas's death, when work grew scarce and sympathy shorter still. A young widow without land or child was an inconvenience to be managed, not a future to be invested in. She looked back at Rust. The horse had lifted his head now, ears angled toward the men, not in fear but in appraisal. He did not stamp or shy. He listened. Mary Lou stepped into the pen without asking permission. The latch squealed, then settled. Up close, the horse smelled of dust and dry hay. She could see where the scar tissue puckered along his side. Old injury healed without tenderness. She reached out slowly, palm open, and placed her hand against his neck. The hide was warm. He did not move away. Behind her, Caldwell cleared his throat, impatience thinning his civility. "Well." Mary Lou kept her hand where it rested. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of coming cold. She had been given a choice that was not a choice at all. Leave empty and light, or carry something the world had already judged worthless. She felt the steady rise and fall beneath her fingers, a breath measured and enduring. "I'll take him," she said. Caldwell laughed once, sharp and brief. "Suit yourself." But as she led Russ from the pen and toward the gate that marked the end of her marriage and the beginning of her exile, the sky deepened from gold to bruised violet. She did not yet know how she would feed him, or herself. She did not know that the scar along his flank hid more history than any man in that yard suspected. She knew only this. When the world had named them both useless, neither had stepped back. And sometimes that was enough to begin. Mary Lou Dawson reached the edge of town near nightfall, the last of the light thinning behind her like a promise reconsidered. Rust walked beside her without rope or protest, his hooves striking the hard road in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The wind had sharpened since she left the ranch, and each gust pressed her thin coat closer to her frame. She did not look back. The boarding shed she had secured that afternoon stood behind a cooper's shop near the rail spur, a narrow structure meant for feed and forgotten tools. The owner, Mrs. Kettering, had agreed to rent it cheap, so long as Mary Lou kept quiet and paid in coin, not favors. The woman's gaze had measured the horse first, then the widow, as though calculating which of them might fail sooner. Inside the shed, moonlight slipped through gaps in the boards and silvered the dust. Mary Lou spread an old quilt in the corner for herself and shook what little hay she had managed to barter into a rough pile for Rust. He lowered his head to it without complaint. She watched him chew, counting each deliberate motion as though it might assure her of tomorrow. The next morning arrived cold and thin. Frost clung to the rail ties and turned the yard brittle beneath her boots. Mary Lou rose before the sun and walked to the pump at the side of the cooper's shop, working the handle until her palms burned and water spilled into the bucket. Russ followed the sound, ears pricked. She set the bucket before him and waited until he drank before she allowed herself to swallow. Work came slowly. She mended torn coats for the railroad men and scrubbed laundry at the boarding house kitchen, hands red from lye and winter water. The coin she earned passed quickly into feed sacks and oats. Some afternoons she went without bread so the horse might have grain. She did not consider this sacrifice. She considered it arithmetic. Townfolk noticed. At the mercantile, Mr. Harlan leaned across his counter and said, "That horse will eat you into the ground, girl." His tone carried warning rather than malice. "You do better to sell him while he still stands." Mary Lou folded her coins into her palm and replied, "He stands well enough." Russ stood tied to the hitching post outside, head lowered, as though conserving the town's judgment along with his strength. Children circled him once, daring one another to touch the cloudy eye. He neither flinched nor snapped. He simply watched, measuring. In the evenings, when work was done and the air grew still, Mary Lou sat on an overturned crate inside the shed and spoke aloud to the horse. She read from old newspapers left behind at the boarding house, reciting crop prices and distant storms as though they were scripture. Her voice filled the narrow space, steady and low. Rust listened. Sometimes he shifted closer, the warmth of his flank easing the chill that crept through the boards. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the plains without warning, black clouds swallowing the sky before the church bell could finish its noon toll. The wind rose in a violent sweep, tearing loose shutters and scattering laundry into the street. Someone shouted that the north pasture fence had given way. Cattle broke through in a frightened rush, hooves drumming the road as they scattered toward the rail yard. Mary Lou was already running. Rust followed without lead or spur, his stride lengthening as though some dormant memory had stirred awake. The first steer bolted past her, eyes wild, foam at its mouth. She planted herself between the animal and the narrow lane that led to the tracks, arms wide, heart hammering uselessly against its own fear. Russ moved then. He angled himself toward the herd's flank, cutting off escape not with speed, but with presence. His body curved, shoulders low, steps deliberate. He did not chase. He redirected. One by one the cattle turned from the rail yard and funneled back toward open ground. The storm snapped and roared around them, but the horse's rhythm did not falter. Mary Lou saw it clearly in that moment. He was not stubborn. He was discerning. When the ranch foreman arrived, hat plastered to his head by rain, he stared at the scene in disbelief. "Where'd he learn that?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Mary Lou did not answer. She was studying Rust's breathing, the way his chest rose evenly despite the chaos. He stood as though the storm were no more than weather, not threat. By dusk the cattle were secured, the fence temporarily mended. The town's gratitude was brief and practical. A few coins pressed in her palm, a nod for men who had not nodded before. Caldwell's ranch hands kept their distance, but word would travel. That night, as rain softened into a steady whisper against the shed roof, a stranger knocked at the open door. He was an older man, coat-worn but boots well-kept, the look of someone who measured stock for a living. His eyes moved over Rust with quiet attention. "Mind if I look closer?" he asked. Mary Lou nodded once. The man circled the horse, fingers brushing lightly along muscle and bone. He paused at the scarred flank, pressing gently where old tissue lay beneath hair. Then he lifted Rust's lip, examining teeth, and finally stepped back. "That ain't a plow horse," he said. "And he ain't useless." Mary Lou held his gaze. "What is he, then?" The man's mouth thinned as though he weighed how much truth to release. "Blood runs in him," he replied. "Strong and old. Someone tried to break it out. Didn't take." Rain tapped the roof harder, as if urging the words forward. "He's got endurance," the stranger continued. "Not the flashy kind. The kind that finishes when others fail." Mary Lou felt something settle inside her. Not hope exactly, but recognition. She had seen that endurance in the storm, in the steady breath beneath her palm. "There's a regional trial come spring," the man added. "Long miles. Hard country. Not many finish clean." He studied her then, as if assessing whether the idea would break or fortify her. "If you're set on keeping him, that's where he'd prove himself." The suggestion hung between them like a dare. After the man departed, leaving only the scent of wet wool and speculation, Mary Lou stood beside Rust in the lamplight. Outside, the storm moved east, leaving the air scrubbed and cold. She pressed her forehead briefly against his neck. "They think you're finished," she murmured. "So do they of me." Rust exhaled, warm against her cheek. In that quiet shed, with coins scarce and winter pressing close, Mary Lou understood that keeping him was no longer an act of stubbornness. It was a wager, against hunger, against scorn, against the verdict already written over them both. She straightened and reached for the small tin box beneath her quilt, where her remaining coins lay stacked like fragile promises. Entry fees cost more than she possessed. Fee would cost more still. Yet when she looked at the horse, she did not see burden. She saw a question waiting to be answered. And for the first time since she left the ranch gate, she found herself willing to risk everything to hear it. By early spring, the frost had retreated into memory, leaving the prairie bare and wind-combed, as though the land itself had been scraped clean for judgment. Mary Lou counted her coins one final time beneath the dim light of the shed lantern and knew the sum would not stretch far enough for caution. The entry fee for the regional endurance trial sat printed in firm black ink on the notice tacked outside the mercantile. It was a figure meant for men with land behind them, not widows renting feed sheds. She sold her wedding band the next morning. The gold weighed almost nothing in Mr. Harlan's scale. Yet when he slid the coins toward her, the sound carried the echo of earth striking a coffin lid. She closed her fingers around the money and felt neither relief nor regret, only resolve. Thomas had once told her that metal could be melted and shaped again. She chose to believe the same of memory. When Caldwell learned of her intent, he did not come himself. He sent his foreman instead, a broad-shouldered man who removed his hat with uneasy courtesy. "Best not stir things you can't settle," the foreman advised. "Caldwell's name's tied to that trial. Don't reflect poorly." Mary Lou met his gaze without defiance. "I've no reflection to cast but my own." The warning lingered after he left, thin as dust in the throat. Yet she saddled Russ the following dawn and rode toward the open country where the trial would be held, a stretch of land known for breaking weaker stock before noon. The starting line was nothing more than a chalkboard nailed to a post and a gathering of riders whose coats bore the cut of prosperity. They studied her with frank curiosity. Some smiled in amusement at the sight of Russ' scarred flank and clouded eye. One young rider leaned toward his companion and murmured loud enough to carry, "Hope she brought a wagon to haul him back." Mary Lou did not answer. She adjusted the girth and laid her palm against Russ' neck, counting the rhythm beneath skin and bone. His breath remained steady, unhurried, as though the distance ahead were already measured and accepted. The horns sounded. They did not rush forward as others did. Mary Lou held Russ to a deliberate pace, letting flashier horses burn themselves bright in the first miles. The land unfolded in long, punishing stretches of scrub and stone. Dust rose in choking clouds. By midday, the sun pressed hard against rider and beast alike. One horse faltered near a dry wash, its rider swearing as the animal's legs trembled. Another stumbled on loose shale and required 2 men to guide it back toward camp. Russ did not surge. He did not falter. He moved as though guided by an internal compass invisible to those who mistook restraint for weakness. At the halfway mark, a veterinarian stood beside a canvas tent, checking pulses and breathing before permitting riders to continue. When Mary Lou dismounted, the man approached Russ with practiced hands. He examined the horse's eyes, his teeth, then paused at the scar along the flank. "Hold him steady," the veterinarian murmured. Mary Lou did not need instruction. Russ stood firm. The man pressed along the scar tissue, then brushed aside hair near the hip. His brow furrowed. "There's a mark beneath here," he said quietly. He fetched a damp cloth and wiped at the faint outline hidden by time. Slowly, beneath layers of healed injury, a brand revealed itself, curved and deliberate, not the common symbol of local ranches, but something older, almost formal. "Where did you come by this horse?" the veterinarian asked. "He was given to me," Mary Lou replied. The man straightened, eyes thoughtful. "This brand belongs to a protected Mustang line. Federal stock. They were gathered north of here some years back. Supposed to be preserved, not sold through private hands." The words carried weight heavier than coin. Mary Lou felt the pieces shift within her understanding. Russ had not simply been neglected. He had been misplaced, perhaps deliberately. A protected bloodline did not drift into slaughter pens without assistance. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I've seen the registry," the veterinarian answered. "This mark was recorded. If he bears it true, someone had no authority to trade him." The horns signaled riders to resume. Questions would have to wait. Yet, as Mary Lou mounted, the knowledge rode with her like a second presence. They finished the trial not in first place, but within the highest ranks of those who completed the course clean. Judges remarked upon Russ' recovery time, the steadiness of his pulse even after miles of strain. Polite applause followed, tinged with surprise rather than celebration. But the true consequence unfolded days later. The veterinarian sought her out at the shed, documents tucked beneath his arm. He had written to a colleague who maintained federal livestock records. Confirmation arrived by post that morning. The brand matched precisely. Russ descended from a line designated for preservation, his sale to private ranch interests marked in no ledger. "Someone diverted him," the veterinarian said. "Illegally. There is only one ranch in the region with both the influence and the audacity to conduct such dealings without scrutiny. Caldwell." Mary Lou understood then that the storm she had weathered in town was minor compared to what this revelation promised. Exposing such a truth would not bring applause. It would bring resistance. As if summoned by thought, Caldwell himself appeared 2 evenings later, boots striking the packed earth outside the shed. He did not remove his hat. "I hear tell you've been asking questions," he began, voice even, "I've been answering them," Mary Lou replied. His gaze flicked to Rust, who stood tethered in lamplight, calm and attentive. "That horse was sold lawful," Caldwell insisted. "Papers signed, money exchanged. Then you'll not object to those papers being reviewed," she said. Silence settled between them, taut as wire. Caldwell's expression hardened by degrees. "You're a girl with no land and no allies. Best mind your position." Mary Lou felt fear move through her like cold water, but she did not allow it to root. "Position is not the same as truth," she answered. He studied her as though recalculating the weight of something previously dismissed. Then he turned and left without further word. In the days that followed, whispers thickened in town. Some urged her to let the matter rest. Others watched from doorways with cautious interest. The veterinarian offered to testify if needed. A retired ranch hand, long silent about Caldwell's practices, approached her quietly and admitted he had once witnessed federal stock delivered under cover of night. Evidence gathered like storm clouds assembling beyond the horizon. When the notice arrived, summoning both parties to appear before the county court, Mary Lou stood beneath the pale dawn sky and held the paper steady despite the tremor in her hand. Rust shifted beside her, breath warm in the cool air. She had sought only to prove a horse's worth. Now she stood at the edge of proving something far larger, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse stood at the center of town like a square, stubborn sentinel, its white paint dulled by years of dust and summer glare. On the morning of the hearing, the air lay cool and undecided, as though even the weather withheld judgment. Mary Lou Dawson arrived before the bell struck 8, Rust's trailer creaking behind the borrowed wagon that carried him. She stepped down onto the packed earth and paused only long enough to steady her breath. Caldwell was already there. He stood near the courthouse steps in a dark coat cut from better cloth than any man in the county could afford without owning half of it. His hat cast a clean shadow over his eyes, and 2 ranch hands flanked him like silent punctuation. He did not look at Mary Lou directly. He did not need to. His presence had long been enough to bend smaller matters aside. Mary Lou tied Rust to the hitching rail beneath a cottonwood tree. The horse stood square and composed, as if the murmurs drifting from the gathering crowd were no more than wind across pasture. She rested her hand briefly against his neck, drawing strength from the steadiness beneath her palm. Then she climbed the courthouse steps alone. Inside, the room smelled faintly of varnish and paper. The judge, an aging man with narrow spectacles and a reputation for patience, took his seat with quiet authority. Townsfolk filled the benches, their expressions cautious, divided between loyalty to Caldwell's influence and curiosity about the widow who had chosen to contest it. Caldwell's attorney spoke first. He presented documents bearing signatures and seals, reciting the language of lawful purchase. His tone carried the confidence of a man accustomed to outcomes decided before they were argued. "My client," he concluded, "conducted his affairs in accordance with regional practice. Any suggestion otherwise rests on speculation." Mary Lou felt the weight of those words press against her ribs. She had no attorney polished in rhetoric. She had only the truth assembled piece by piece. When the judge invited her to respond, she rose slowly. Her dress was plain, her hands marked by work that left no room for softness. She did not raise her voice. "I do not contest that money changed hands," she began. "I contest the right by which it did." A ripple passed through the room. She called the veterinarian to the stand. The man removed his hat and swore his oath with the gravity of one who understood the cost of speaking plainly. He described the brand concealed beneath scar tissue, the registry confirming its origin among federally protected Mustang lines. He produced correspondence bearing official letterhead and dates that predated any record of private sale. Caldwell's attorney attempted to undermine the testimony, suggesting error in identification, confusion in record-keeping. The veterinarian did not bristle. He answered each question with measured clarity, returning always to the same point. The brand matched precisely, and no authorization existed for its transfer. Next came the retired ranch hand, shoulders stooped, but gaze unclouded by fear. He spoke of nights when unmarked trailers arrived under cover of darkness, of horses driven quickly into Caldwell's pens before dawn could reveal their markings. He admitted his own silence then, explaining it as the weakness of a man who needed wages more than justice. Caldwell rose at that, indignation flashing across his features. "Lies born of spite," he declared. But the ranch hand did not falter. "Spite don't keep a man awake for years," he replied. "Truth does." Mary Lou listened as if each word were a plank laid beneath her feet, forming a bridge she dared not look down from. When at last she was asked to speak again, she stepped forward and placed her palm upon the table before her, steadying herself not from fear but from the magnitude of what she carried. "I was told the horse was useless," she said. "I was told he would amount to nothing and cost more than he gave. I have seen him work in storm and distance without breaking. I have seen him endure where others failed. If he was taken unlawfully, then his worth was not merely dismissed. It was concealed." Her gaze shifted to Caldwell, meeting his directly for the first time. "And if that is so, then the concealment was not accident. It was choice." Silence followed, thick and complete. The judge removed his spectacles and regarded the assembled faces as though weighing more than testimony. "The matter before this court," he said at last, "is not sentiment but statute. The evidence presented suggests credible violation of federal livestock protections. This court orders a formal investigation and immediate suspension of any claim Mr. Caldwell asserts over the animal in question." A collective breath released. "Pending review," the judge continued, "custody of the horse shall remain with Mrs. Dawson. Should the federal findings confirm unlawful transfer, restitution shall be considered." Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he did not protest further. Influence faltered where documentation stood firm. Outside, sunlight broke through thinning cloud as Mary Lou descended the courthouse steps. Townsfolk parted to let her pass, their expressions altered in ways subtle yet unmistakable. Rust lifted his head when she approached, ears angling toward her as though he had followed every word through the open window. She untied the lead and rested her forehead briefly against his neck. "It isn't finished," she murmured. And it was not. Weeks later, federal agents arrived with ledgers and stern inquiries. Records were seized. Additional brands were traced. What had begun as a single contested horse widened into scrutiny of an entire operation. Caldwell's holdings diminished under fines and oversight. Men who had once guarded his silence now guarded their own futures. When official confirmation came that Rust belonged to a protected lineage and had been transferred without authority, the court awarded permanent ownership to Mary Lou and levied restitution sufficient to secure modest land beyond town. She did not celebrate loudly. She purchased acreage where grass grew honest and fences could be built straight. She mended the barn with her own hands. Other neglected horses found their way to her pasture, drawn by rumor and quiet invitation. In late summer, she entered Rust in the National Endurance Meet, not to prove a point, but to honor one. The course stretched unforgiving across sun-bleached terrain. Riders who had once smirked now nodded with respect. When the horns sounded, Mary Lou set Rust to his measured pace. Miles fell behind them like chapters completed. One by one, swifter horses faltered. Rust's stride remained unbroken, his breath even as dawn turned to heat and heat bent toward dusk. In the final stretch, as the crowd's murmur swelled, Mary Lou leaned forward and whispered, "Steady." He answered with strength held in reserve. They crossed the line not in spectacle, but in certainty. As applause rose, Mary Lou did not lift her arms or bow her head. She dismounted and pressed her cheek to the scarred flank that had once marked him for slaughter. The victory lay not in the ribbon placed in her hand, but in the simple fact that endurance had outlived deceit. When evening settled over her new pasture weeks later, she stood at the fence and watched Rust graze among open acres. The same faded gold light that had witnessed her exile now bathed ground she owned. The world had called them useless once. It had been mistaken.